EU says no change. British MPs back the Prime Minister's proposals for a renegotiation, but the EU won't move on the controversial Irish backstop.
I don't think there is room to do that for the simple reason that the backstop is absolutely needed, and the backstop is in the withdrawal agreement.
Former Nissan boss Carlos Ghosn, in a first interview since his arrest, alleges that Nissan conspired against him. As more anti-government protests are expected in Venezuela, President Maduro says there will be no elections in his country until 2025. And inside the polar vortex, parts of the US are braced for life-threatening freezing temperatures. They could be the worst in a generation. Hello and welcome to GMT. I'm Lucy Hawkins. EU leaders have again insisted there will be no revisions to the withdrawal deal with the UK. It follows a vote in the British Parliament calling for changes to be made in the document to the backstop border arrangements for Northern Ireland that would see the UK remain in the EU's customs union until a free trade deal was agreed. Well, despite last night's developments, the European Council President Donald Tusk insisted the existing agreement is not open for renegotiation. And the EU's chief negotiator made the statement this morning to reporters. Have a listen.
The position of the European Union is very clear. It has been expressed yesterday by the President Tusk, and the President Juncker will make a statement to the Parliament this afternoon. So thank you very much.
So we're waiting for that statement from President Juncker, but let's remind you of what happened in the British Parliament last night. There was a number of amendments debated, a dramatic sitting in the House of Commons. The key vote calling for changes to the backstop was passed by a majority of 16. This is really being seen here by many as a victory for the government. Another non-binding amendment passed as well, saying that Parliament was opposed to a no-deal Brexit. So what happens next? Let's hear from the British Prime Minister.
It is now clear that there is a route that can secure a substantial and sustainable majority in this House for leaving the EU with a deal. We will now take this mandate forward and seek to obtain legally binding changes to withdrawal agreement that deal with concerns on the backstop while guaranteeing no return to a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
We'll be talking more about Brexit coming up on GMT. We're live in Brussels as well for more on the reaction from there. But time to take you to Japan. The former motor tycoon Carlos Ghosn, who was arrested in November on financial misconduct charges, has accused Nissan of plotting against him. He has given his first interview since his arrest. Mr. Ghosn said some in Nissan opposed his plans to integrate Renault, the French company he headed, with its Japanese partners Nissan and Mitsubishi, and he reiterated that he is innocent of the charges levelled against him. Let's take you to Rupert Winfield-Hayes, who is in Tokyo for us. These are quite stunning allegations from Mr. Ghosn. Rupert, tell us more about what he said in this interview.
Yeah, that's right, Lucy. It's pretty much a full frontal attack on his former colleagues, other executives at Nissan, accusing them, as you say, of plotting and of treason. And the implication of what Mr. Ghosn has said in this first interview is that the case against him is essentially political. So he's saying that Nissan executives wanted to bring him down, and the implication is that it's because he was moving towards further integration of Nissan with what is essentially its parent company, the French company Renault. And he said he had discussed those plans with Nissan's current CEO, Hiroto Saikawa, back in September last year, just 2 months before the charges against him were brought, or rather the allegations against him were brought, and he was arrested. So he's saying that this is political, and he's also saying that the charges are fabricated because he's done nothing wrong, and that if there is any wrongdoing in his financial dealings within Nissan, then others are also responsible because every decision he made, he says, was signed off by lawyers and by other executives.
Is he referring to specific things as well, Rupert? There's been a lot of talk about this money he paid, I think about 15 million to a Saudi man?
That's correct. So in the actual indictment against him by the Tokyo prosecutor's office, he is accused of financial wrongdoing, and the specific allegations relate to a $15 million payment to a Saudi businessman which was made out of a CEO's discretionary fund, and the accusation is that Mr. Ghosn was paying off a friend who had helped him out of financial difficulties after the 2008 financial crash, during which Mr. Ghosn had lost a lot of money in foreign exchange dealings. Now, Mr. Ghosn said that payment of $15 million was signed off by 4 senior Nissan executives, including the executive who ran the Middle East. So if it was wrong in any way, then there are 4 people who signed off on that, not him alone.
Rupert, good to see you. Fascinated to hear some of those details. Carlos Ghosn talking to the Japanese Nikkei newspaper. They had a 20-minute interview with him in his detention house. Now, the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, has told the Russian news agency RIA that his victory in elections last spring was legitimate and transparent. He said if America and others wanted a fresh vote, they'd have to wait to the end of his current term. Now that is 2025. More anti-government protests are planned later as the political crisis in the country deepens. The opposition leader, Juan Guaido, who declared himself interim president last week, has now been banned from travelling. He's also had his assets frozen. Well, more than 20 nations have followed the US in recognising Mr. Guaido as Venezuela's president. It's a move which saw Nicolas Maduro cut diplomatic ties with the US. Let's have a listen to some of the interview he's just given.
This is happening for the first time in history. That shows how desperate they are in the White House. They can't cope with Venezuela. What can I do? I'm carrying out my duties as Commander-in-Chief in accordance with the Constitution.
Well, watching that interview for us was Sarah Rainsford, who is in Moscow. Sarah, just take us through some of the key points from Mr. Maduro.
Well, I think really the key point to take away from it is how defiant Nicolas Maduro was sounding. This is a man, of course, very much embattled in Venezuela, but standing firm and by his rights, as he sees it, as the elected president of that country. So he was saying that the elections last spring were legitimate, they were transparent. He said he won 68% of the vote, and for anyone to try to replace him, he said, was wrong. He said, who is America to decide what happens in Venezuela? He talked about imperialists, he talked about neo-colonialism, as he likes to do, but he said that Venezuela and his presidency won't accept ultimatums from anyone or what he called blackmail. Now, the other couple of key points, I think, from that interview was that Mr. Maduro was claiming and insisting that the Venezuelan military, crucially, its leadership remains loyal to him. He talked about loyal and disciplined military forces in Venezuela who still recognize him as commander-in-chief, and he said he continues to carry out that role. And then finally, he repeated what he has said before, which is that he would be prepared to hold talks with the opposition, and he suggested that his ministers were currently looking for international countries or figures who might be able to mediate in such talks. So defiant, with a little hint that there might be some kind of room for talks. But so far, of course, those talks have not materialized.
Sarah, on social media, there's a lot of talk about this so-called mystery Russian plane on the tarmac in Caracas. What do we know about that?
Well, that's right. This is a charter flight from Russia, which left on Monday from here. It's Nordwind Airlines, and the point is, I guess, that is an airline which does not normally fly to Venezuela. So when its flight was picked up by a newspaper here, and then the plane was spotted and photographed on the tarmac in Venezuela, there was an awful lot of speculation on social media about what exactly it might be doing there. Clearly not taking hundreds of Russian tourists into Venezuela right at this crisis point in the country's politics. And in fact, the report was that this was an empty plane with 2 crews on board, the suggestion being that it could turn around quickly and come back to Moscow. So social media in Venezuela and also here in Russia has been full of speculation that plane is there potentially carrying, one suggestion was some mercenaries from Russia to guard President Maduro, a key ally, of course, of Moscow. Another suggestion that it was there for Mr. Maduro to escape if and when he was ousted from power by a popular uprising. So a lot of speculation, a lot of rumour, but absolutely no facts about what that plane is doing there on the tarmac in Caracas.
Sarah, remind us what Russia gets out of backing Venezuela and President Maduro in this way.
Well, Russia's position in this crisis is to stress that Mr. Maduro is the legitimate and elected president of Venezuela, and to say that the attempts to oust him and to recognize Juan Guaido, the leader of the opposition, as the interim leader there, is a path to disaster and to catastrophic consequences. Also, we've heard officials here talking about the potential for bloodshed. Russia has huge financial commitments in Venezuela. It's given an awful lot of credit to Mr. Maduro, and its oil companies are very heavily committed there. So I think there's big economic interest, but also political interest. I think Russia is a key ally of Nicolas Maduro, has been for some time.
Sarah, thanks so much for joining us from Moscow. Let's return to our top story now. Dramatic scenes in the House of Commons here in London last night. Theresa May winning parliamentary backing for seeking changes to that arrangement that will see a hard border being avoided with Ireland once Britain leaves the EU. What do they think of all of this in Brussels? Let's take you to our Europe correspondent Gavin Lee, who is there for us. Give us a sense of the reaction there to all of this, Gavin.
I think not for the first time there are two separate narratives. We've got this sense that the Conservatives may be coming together now, and possibly this almost Henry V-esque once more into the breach moment where they're ready to come to Brussels with a plan to have an alternative arrangement to the backstop. The trouble is, here in Brussels, and the messages that have come out from European leaders is that it's a fool's errand. We've had leaders tweeting. Last night, Sebastian Kurz from Austria, Emmanuel Macron gave a statement as well, saying you will not change the withdrawal agreement, and that's where the backstop is, this insurance plan to avoid a border on the island of Ireland. We have Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, who's also said that we cannot change the withdrawal agreement. We can look at the other thing, not the 585-page legal documents that was the divorce deal, but the political declaration, 20-odd pages, which sets out the broad terms of the future, not legally binding, but that's not what Theresa May wants. So she's coming here. We don't know yet when. We know in the last few minutes that she will speak to Donald Tusk by phone this evening. And unless she has some pretty incredible, persuasive, hypnotic skills, I think at the moment it looks like she'll be having a short phone call, short meeting here in Brussels, because they are a wall right now that's united, saying we will not go back to the withdrawal agreement, think again.
Gavin, good to see you. Thanks so much. The perspective there from Brussels. Think again, he is saying. With me now is Ian Anderson, who is the chairman of the Cicero Group, a communications and marketing research agency. You heard it there from Gavin, and I think we've heard it from all EU leaders. Think again. It doesn't matter what Theresa May and the MPs decide here in London. We're not renegotiating. What do you make of it all?
Well, look, this is a kind of opening gambit, I think, to the next stage of this never-ending saga. The EU's saying right now it's not prepared to renegotiate. Yet we're between a rock and a hard place. The British Parliament's been stuck, absolutely stuck, since Theresa May negotiated this deal back in December. It's not moved at all, and the government faced its biggest ever defeat, biggest defeat in parliamentary history. So we got some wiggle room yesterday for Theresa May's deal, and that wiggle room is, yes, she has to go back and see if she can negotiate. Now, I've got more of my eyes today on Dublin than I do on Brussels. The phone lines between London and Dublin have been very, very hot this morning. A no-deal, crash-out Brexit is as difficult for Ireland as it is for the United Kingdom.
But that is one of the things that EU leaders want to reiterate. They're unified. There are no cracks in the EU unity. We may be seeing them over here, but they're going to back Ireland 100%, and that's why they're saying we're not prepared to renegotiate on the backstop.
Well, they're going to back Ireland, but Ireland's also thinking right now about the impacts of a crash-out deal on the Irish economy. There's so much trade that flows through the United Kingdom to Ireland and vice versa to get back and forward into the EU. Now, Ireland's remained very, very steadfast up until this point. Let's see now what happens. This is all politics. This is all about deal making. And as we've seen in the EU time and time again, often that deal gets made at the very last minute.
So in your mind, Ian, because a no deal would be mutually assured chaos for everyone, they are going to be keen, every single party involved in this, to avoid that?
Well, what I'm told, and I spent a bit of time earlier today with some folks in the British government, and they're very, very, very quickly going to be into this potential for renegotiation. So Theresa May today is working through what her options are. She's going to come back to the British Parliament in about an hour and have Prime Minister's questions. She's going to get asked some fairly tough questions as to what she's going to do next. My understanding is that they're going to try and start to reopen that negotiation before we get to the weekend, and that by the 13th of February, that's the next date for us all to look out for. She wants to be able to come back to the British Parliament to see whether or not she's been able to renegotiate a change.
How disillusioned is the British public in the political system right now, Ian?
I think people are in despair. I mean, I've never seen a more febrile, animated, fractious British Parliament. This has gone on and on and on for the last 3 years. I think most people, certainly most businesses, the people I'm working with, global businesses that are investing here in the UK, just want to see a good deal. But there's an awful lot of ifs still on the horizon.
Ian, good to have your thoughts. Thanks so much for joining us. Do stay with us here on BBC World News. Still to come, parts of the US are bracing for potentially life-threatening freezing temperatures. Forecasters say they could be the worst in a generation. Welcome back to GMT. Parts of the US are bracing for a once-in-a-generation deep freeze. A spinning pocket of very cold air, known as a polar vortex, is expected to bring potentially life-threatening temperatures as low as almost minus 30 degrees Celsius, with some areas feeling colder than Antarctica. Here's Andy Moore.
Forecasters say temperatures like this only happen once in a generation. On the frozen Chicago River, it looked as if icebreakers were needed. In Iowa, people were warned to avoid taking deep breaths and to minimize talking if they were going outside. Chicago's mayor said the weather was life-threatening.
If you don't need to be outside at this time, don't go outside. The temperatures today are not, and rather today, tomorrow and Thursday are not to be taken lightly. These are actually a public health risk.
Conditions on many roads were treacherous. At least 2 deaths have already been blamed on the cold weather. It's affecting 55 million people and stretching far further south than usual. Temperatures are forecast to fall to as low as minus 40 degrees Celsius in some parts today, and with added wind chill, it will feel even colder. In conditions like that, you can get frostbite within 10 minutes of going outside. Airports struggled to keep their runways open and failed in many cases. More than 2,000 flights were cancelled. The bad weather has hit Canada as well. In Toronto, they've been digging out after 26 centimetres or 10 inches of snow. That's their biggest snowfall in a decade. Andy Moore, BBC News.
Everyone in the US talking about the weather, including the president. Let's show you his tweet from a few days ago, saying in the beautiful Midwest, wind chill temperatures are reaching minus 60 degrees, the coldest ever recorded. In coming days, it's expected to get even colder. People can't last outside even for minutes. What the hell is going on with global warming? I have to point out that is his spelling mistake, President Trump. He means global warming. Please come back. We need you. Now, lots of people have been quick to point out the president appeared to confuse the weather with the climate. In fact, he's being trolled, I think, by his own government meteorological agency, putting out this tweet, widely seen, of course, as a rebuttal. Winter storms don't prove that global warming isn't happening. This has been retweeted 24,000 times. So what is going on? Tomas is with me now. Tell me about this polar vortex.
Well, you know, the thing is, it's actually always there. It's in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, and it's above the poles, and it is an area of very cold air that's spinning around. Now, I'm going to use an analogy to explain what's happening in the US right now. I mentioned that the polar vortex spins. It's a cold bubble of air that spins around really fast. Now, sometimes this polar vortex can get a little bit disrupted. It's not a perfect circle. It can sort of meander a little bit like a river. Now, here's the analogy. Take a cup of coffee. Let's have it black first, okay? We're going to put some milk or cream or whatever it is that you have.
Half and half.
Half and half. I have black Americano. So spin it round really, really fast. So we're spinning the coffee, and of course the cream and the coffee are starting to mix, and you can clearly see a big swirl in your coffee. It's a circle but spinning around. That's what we've got over the northern poles and the southern poles, cold air spinning around. Now once this spinning starts to slow, because it's not going to spin all the time, it gets slower and slower, and then what you see in your coffee, the cream starts to meander. You get these little swirls and fancy little patterns, don't you? We sort of sometimes in a coffee shop we stare at it and see these little areas swirling around. That's what's happening across the northern pole at the moment. So this polar vortex isn't a perfect circle, it's sort of meandering and bits of it are breaking away, and that's what's happening over Canada and the Midwest right now. A bit of it has broken away, and effectively we've got cold Arctic air sliding further south, but it's not the polar vortex that's bringing the cold air. The polar vortex is affecting the atmosphere close to the ground where the cold air is.
Now, interesting that you mentioned Canada. I'm married to a Canadian. My producer upstairs is a Canadian. They're like, they're used to this kind of cold up there.
Yeah.
They're not in America. Is it a once-in-a-generation?
Well, we had it in the mid-80s, and we've had it in the 90s. I mean, it depends what you define once in a generation. To me, once in a generation, just me, sounds like something like once in a 50 years. We had it 20 years ago, so it depends what your definition is, but these are extremely low temperatures.
And Thomas, it's the wind chill as well.
It's the wind chill. That's the next thing, because how we feel hot or cold isn't just to do with the temperature of the air itself. Temperature of the air is just how quickly the particles in the atmosphere, or the molecules, are moving. The feeling hot or cold is more than just that. It's also how humid the air is, how fast the wind is blowing. And when the wind is blowing quite strong, about 20 miles an hour in Chicago, say, and you have such a low temperature, the wind strips the heat off our skin. The skin has no protection anymore, and then with these low temperatures we can start to see ice crystals forming in the skin. Our blood vessels start to contract. We get less blood supply. It damages the nerve endings. That's when we get frostbite.
So absolutely terrible for anyone who's vulnerable or homeless.
We're talking about minutes before this frostbite occurs.
How long is this going to go on for?
Well, actually, the crazy thing is that by the time we get to Saturday, the temperature in Chicago, from say around minus 30 degrees overnight, 30 degrees Celsius, will be up to plus 10 during the day. So we're talking about a 40-degree difference. So it's going to feel as if Chicago's put itself right in the tropics. Right, Miami and Chicago have swapped, literally.
Meanwhile, they're hunkering down there, staying inside, and others at school or anything. Okay, Thomas, thanks so much for that explanation. I'll remember that all day, the cream and the coffee, the half and half in the coffee. Let's bring you some of the day's other news now. A grenade attack on a mosque in the southern Philippines has killed 2 people. The attack in Zamboanga happened 3 days after 20 people were killed in a bombing at a cathedral on the nearby island of Jolo. Islamic State said it carried out that attack. US intelligence chiefs have repeatedly contradicted President Trump in their annual assessment of security threats facing the country. A Senate committee heard that North Korea was unlikely to give up its nuclear weapons, and Iran was not actively seeking to build them. It was also told that there were thousands of Islamic State militants in Iraq, Syria and elsewhere. A new study has found the genetic makeup that governs whether people are early or late risers is also a factor in their risk of developing some mental health disorders. An international team of researchers writing in Nature Communications says that so-called night owls are more predisposed to depression and schizophrenia than people who wake early. The Grammy Award-winning singer James Ingram has died at the age of 66. He was a chart regular for many years with a string of hits including Yama Be There and Somewhere Out There. The R&B star worked regularly with Quincy Jones and received 2 Oscar nominations for his songwriting. Before we go, letting one's dog off the lead in a public place can sometimes be a bit risky. A quiet morning on the horse racing gallops for trainer Jamie Osborne, filming this when... Watch what happens.
He will be entered Saturday and Monday. He'll hopefully find the right slot for... Bobby! Bobby! Bobby, come here!
Yes, that's his Whippet Bobby, chasing after a string of racehorses. The film evoked memories for many of the infamous video of Fenton the dog chasing deer in London's Richmond Park. The trainer later tweeting that Bobby had safely recovered from her morning exercise. Looks like she had a great time. You can reach me on Twitter. I'm at Lucy Hawkins.